Of the seven wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon occupy a singular position. They are the only one for which no archaeological evidence has ever been conclusively identified, and the only one that contemporary Babylonian sources, the meticulous cuneiform records that Mesopotamian scribes kept on clay tablets across thousands of years, do not mention at all. Every other wonder left some physical trace, some documentary footprint, some confirmed location. The Hanging Gardens left only descriptions, written by Greeks who may never have seen them, centuries after they were supposed to have existed. And yet they have fascinated the world for 2.5 millennia, inspiring gardens, paintings, poems, and engineering projects across every civilization that inherited the classical tradition. The mystery is the point. The Hanging Gardens are, above everything else, a story about what humanity chooses to remember and why. Babylon. The city that defined an era. New section. To understand what the Hanging Gardens meant to the ancient world, one must first understand what Babylon was. At its height under Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled from 605 to 562 BCE, Babylon was the largest city on earth, with a population estimated at somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 people. It was the center of an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt, and its wealth, cultural output, and physical grandeur were without parallel in the ancient Near East. The city's walls, double-ringed, were famous enough to be considered a wonder in their own right by some ancient authors. The Ishtar Gate, faced in glazed blue brick with lions and dragons in relief, still partially survives and is one of the most spectacular pieces of ancient architecture ever recovered. The Ziggurat of Marduk, the stepped temple tower at the city's heart, rising in several stages to a summit shrine, was probably the inspiration for the biblical Tower of Babel. This was the city in which, according to tradition, the Hanging Gardens were built. The story, as told by Greek historians writing centuries after the fact, is a love story. Nebuchadnezzar II had married Amytis, a princess from Media, the mountainous region of what is now northwestern Iran. Amytis was homesick. The flat, dusty plains of Mesopotamia, hot and arid and treeless, bore no resemblance to the green hills and forests of her homeland. The king, wishing to ease her suffering, ordered the construction of an artificial mountain of terraced gardens that would recreate, in the heart of the Babylonian plain, the landscape she had left behind. Whether this story is true, romanticized, or entirely invented is one of the questions the ancient record cannot answer. It is, however, a story of compelling emotional logic, the most powerful man in the world doing something enormous and impractical for love. And that logic has sustained it for 25 centuries. The architecture, engineering the impossible. The structural descriptions provided by ancient authors, while varying in their specifics, converge on a consistent general picture. The gardens were a multi-level terrace structure, rising in successive platforms like a stepped pyramid, each level planted with trees, shrubs, flowers, and climbing plants. The supporting structure was built from fired brick laid in thick courses, waterproofed with asphalt and sealed with sheets of lead, a sophisticated approach to damp-proofing that reflected genuine understanding of the problem. Without effective waterproofing, water seeping through the soil of the upper terraces would saturate and eventually destroy the brick foundations below. The use of lead sheeting in particular suggests a level of engineering sophistication that was not accidental. The height described by various sources ranges from approximately 25 to over 75 meters, a spread that suggests either that different sources were describing different things, or that the figures were exaggerated in the retelling. What can be said with confidence is that the structure was large enough and impressive enough to be visible from a considerable distance, that the uppermost terraces were at a height sufficient to provide views over the city walls, and that the experience of walking through it, moving from the dusty heat of the Babylonian street into a shaded, moisture-laden environment of dense vegetation, would have been genuinely extraordinary. The water problem. Ancient engineering at its limits expanded. The most technically challenging aspect of the Hanging Gardens was not their construction but their maintenance. Moving water upward against gravity, continuously, in quantities sufficient to sustain a multi-level garden in the Mesopotamian climate, where summer temperatures regularly exceed 40 degrees Celsius and rainfall is minimal, required a hydraulic system of exceptional sophistication. The ancient sources mention various mechanisms. Some describe a kind of Archimedean screw, a helical device that lifts water by rotation. Others describe chain pumps with buckets of leather or bronze, operated by teams of workers in relays. The Archimedean screw is often cited as an anachronism, since Archimedes lived in the 3rd century BCE and the gardens are traditionally dated to the 6th, but similar lifting devices are documented in Mesopotamia before Archimedes gave his name to the principle. Whatever mechanism was used, the labor required to maintain it was continuous and substantial. The gardens were not simply built, they had to be operated, every day, by a dedicated workforce whose sole purpose was keeping water moving upward. The soil management problem was equally complex. Sufficient depth of growing medium to support mature trees, the ancient sources specifically describe large trees with extensive root systems, requires a layer of soil several meters deep. That weight, distributed across the upper terraces, imposed enormous structural loads on the vaulted ceilings below. The engineering of the supporting structure had to account not just for the static weight of the filled terraces but for the dynamic loads imposed by growing trees, irrigation water, and the movement of people through the garden levels. This was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most technically demanding construction projects of the ancient world. The archaeological problem, why nothing has been found. New section. The site of ancient Babylon, near the modern Iraqi city of Hilla, approximately 85 kilometers south of Baghdad, has been excavated in various campaigns since the late 19th century, most systematically by the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey between 1899 and 1917. Koldewey's excavations identified the Ishtar Gate, the Processional Way, the Palace of Nebuchadnezzar, and numerous other major structures. He also identified a vaulted underground structure near the northern corner of the palace that he proposed, tentatively, as the foundation of the Hanging Gardens, noting that its unusual construction, with barrel-vaulted ceilings thick enough to support the weight of planted terraces above, and its proximity to a well with an unusual triple-shaft design that might have served a chain pump mechanism, was consistent with the ancient descriptions. Most subsequent archaeologists have been skeptical of this identification, noting that the structure appears to have been a storage facility and that its location is inconsistent with the optimal positioning for a garden of the described type. More recent ground-penetrating radar surveys of the site have not identified any structure that clearly corresponds to the Hanging Gardens. The difficulty is compounded by the fact that the site has been extensively damaged. By looters across the centuries, by the construction of a German railway line through the site in the early 20th century, by an American military base built on the ruins during the Iraq War, and by the continued activities of looters in the post-2003 period of instability. The Nineveh hypothesis, a wonder in the wrong city expanded. The most significant challenge to the traditional account came from the work of Dr. Stephanie Dalley of Oxford University, published over several decades beginning in the 1990s. Dalley's research in Assyrian cuneiform texts led her to propose that the Hanging Gardens were not in Babylon at all, but in Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, located near modern Mosul in northern Iraq, and that they were built not by Nebuchadnezzar II but by the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who ruled from 705 to 681 BCE. Dalley's argument rests on several interconnected observations. Sennacherib's own cuneiform inscriptions describe the construction of elaborate gardens at Nineveh with a specificity and technical detail that matches the Greek descriptions of the Hanging Gardens far more closely than anything found in Babylonian records. He describes raising water to the upper levels of the gardens using a bronze, water-raising device, almost certainly a form of Archimedean screw or chain pump, and planting the terraces with trees from across his empire. He also describes building a new palace that he calls, the wonder of all peoples, and his pride in the achievement is evident in the extravagance of the language he uses. Assyrian palace reliefs from the period of Sennacherib and his successors show garden terraces with tall trees growing on elevated platforms, visual evidence that precisely this kind of landscaping was practiced in Nineveh. The confusion between Babylon and Nineveh, Dalley argues, arose after the Assyrian Empire collapsed and Nineveh was destroyed in 612 BCE. When Greek travelers and writers encountered the tradition of the Great Gardens, they were working from accounts that had passed through several generations of transmission and had become associated with Babylon, the great Mesopotamian city that persisted in the Greek imagination as the archetype of Eastern luxury and power, rather than with the destroyed Assyrian capital. The name Semiramis, the legendary Assyrian queen sometimes associated with the gardens in ancient accounts, is itself a Hellenized form of an Assyrian royal name, which would be consistent with the Nineveh hypothesis. What the ancient authors said. New section. 5 principal ancient authors describe the Hanging Gardens. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in the 3rd century BCE who is the earliest source. Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian of the 1st century BCE, Strabo, the geographer writing around the turn of the Common Era, Quintus Curtius Rufus, a Roman historian of the 1st century CE, and Philo of Byzantium, whose description appears in a compilation of texts about the 7 wonders. None of them claims to have seen the gardens in person. Berossus, the closest in time and place, describes them in terms that suggest they were already legendary in his era. Diodorus and Strabo both write from considerable temporal and geographical distance, drawing on earlier sources they do not always identify. The descriptions they provide are consistent enough to suggest a shared underlying tradition, but inconsistent enough in specific details, height, materials, the identity of the builder, to confirm that none of the authors had access to direct, reliable information. Notably, not a single Babylonian cuneiform text. And the Babylonians were meticulous record keepers whose clay tablets survive in enormous quantities, mentions anything resembling the Hanging Gardens. This silence is the strongest argument against their existence in Babylon. It does not prove they did not exist. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the specific records that might have described the gardens may simply not have survived. But the silence is striking, and it is one of the reasons Dalley's Nineveh hypothesis has attracted serious scholarly attention. The legacy, a garden that changed civilization. Whether the Hanging Gardens existed in Babylon, in Nineveh, or nowhere at all except in the human imagination, their influence on the subsequent history of garden design, landscape architecture, and the concept of the designed natural environment is entirely real. The idea that a garden could be a work of art, not merely a productive space for growing food but a deliberate aesthetic creation intended to produce emotional and sensory effects, was transmitted through the classical tradition from Mesopotamia to Greece, from Greece to Rome, and from Rome to the entire subsequent history of Western civilization. The great gardens of the Renaissance, the formal gardens of Versailles, the English landscape garden, the modern urban park. All of these are, in some sense, descendants of the tradition that the Hanging Gardens represent, and that they did more than any other single project to fix in the cultural imagination. The gardens also introduced into Western thought a concept that has never left it, the idea that human power and human love can remake the natural world, that the landscape itself can be a gift, that the highest expression of a ruler's greatness might be not conquest but creation. The transformation of a dusty plain into a mountain of green, for the comfort of someone who missed the hills of home. That idea, whatever its historical basis, is one of the most enduring contributions of the ancient Near East to the civilization that came after it.